line.
If I get a blank stare from you, then I'm
Yeah. It means that I couldn't hear a word you said.
And by the way, I'm Chris. This is Liam.
I'm Liam.
Thank you all for joining us. Should we just kick off?
Yeah, let's jump in.
All right. Well, Liam, I've known forever. We're both based in, you're based in Lille now. I'm based in Paris. You're now with Scaleway for about a year now? 2 years?
Yeah, a little over a year.
So let's just start there. People have probably been hearing the name Scaleway throughout this conference. Very briefly, what is Scaleway?
Yeah, so most simply, Scaleway is a European alternative to major cloud providers, AWS, GCP, Azure. We've got 6 data centers in Europe, 3 in Paris, 2 in Amsterdam, soon to be 3, and 1 in Warsaw, soon to be 3. So we're building a full-fledged cloud provider. The only difference is we're building it from Europe, inside of Europe. Our headquarters are based in Paris. We employ people all around Europe. We've got teams locally based here. We've got teams locally in Italy, Germany, pretty much all over Europe. And our goal really is to provide a fantastic service for the next generation of European startups to scale on top of.
Yeah, and we should also note Scaleway is a new name, newish name, but it's not a new company.
No. Yeah, I mean, the history of cloud in Europe is a really interesting one. Because before there was what is generally called the public cloud, this sort of idea of like, I need a machine for 4 seconds, so I buy it, I use it, and then I get rid of it. There was actually predecessors. There was, of course, on-premise, and there was kind of a middle era that Europe was really fond of, which was kind of the dedicated machine, dedicated servers, or bare metal is what we call it today. And Scaleway's historical business was serving that. There's players all over Europe that provide basically, I buy a machine, I put it in a room, I plug it into an Ethernet cable, and I let you rent it by the month. And that was kind of the predecessor to the public internet. And then they figured out, well, I don't need the whole machine, I just need the GPU so that I can do machine learning algorithms on it. Or I don't need, I want to have 1,000 machines, but I only want to have them when I have a lot of traffic. And so then the public cloud market came where you could have fractional ownership, and you could also have time sequence ownership where you could be charged by the hour. And so Scaleway's been around for 20 years. We've had infrastructure for 20 years. We've been doing this for 20 years. And basically about 10 years ago, as the public cloud market was coming, obviously it came very quickly from the US. The US skipped the entire bare metal era of the cloud. They just went straight to the public cloud. And Scaleway saw this and said, okay, this is obviously the future. And they started building from scratch, in-house, an entire technical stack. And when you want to build a cloud provider, it's a lot like building a software company, except a million times harder. Because we have to build the machines, we have to buy them, we have to put them in rooms, we have to cable them together, then we have to build the software that reads the machines, then we have to build the software that exposes the machines to the customers, then we have to build the interface, then we build a software company.
So let me just pull back a layer from that, because the other interesting thing about what you're describing, of course, and I'm probably like the old man in the room from my Silicon Valley days, but the other interesting thing on top of that dynamic you're describing is that move from on-premise to the cloud, or the mix of on-premise and cloud, really, the last decade really unleashed a kind of new wave and a new type of entrepreneurship. Because, when I was originally in Silicon Valley, you wanted to start pets.com, you had to go out and buy 2,000 servers or whatever you needed to do that. So that's a huge barrier for, so then we moved to cloud and then mobile, and really you get to the 2 people in the room could launch a company, and so we've been, and then SaaS came on top of that, and so we had this sort of, above the layers of technology you're describing, it enabled this certain types of entrepreneurship that have really driven, and that Europe specifically has really taken advantage of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess everything that we see now going on in the European startup ecosystem, and as well in the Asian and American and South American and Australian, is really the result of cloud computing. Cloud computing did a number of things. It took the cost, it used to cost $120,000 just to start a company. You had to buy the machines, rent the space in the room, get the people who were going to deploy it and manage it, and that basically went from $120,000 to $1,200 overnight. So the floor dropped out, and the barrier to entry went up. And coupled with global infrastructure meant that anyone, anywhere could build a global business. And so most of this generation, if you're wondering why European startups are happening now so much in Latvia, in Estonia, in Finland, all over Europe, is because of that. That just unlocked this huge access to building a global business from day one, from anywhere. And for the most part, we're kind of coming up on the end of that era, which is, 12 years ago, this VC firm, Andreessen Horowitz, wrote this article called, they coined this phrase, they said, software will eat the world. Has anyone heard this phrase before? Software will eat the world? There's an article, 2007, you can go and Google it, or whatever your preferred search engine is. Software will eat the world. 2007, they said, look at what just happened. AWS just launched. Software will eat everything. And for the most part, every industry has been utterly overturned by software because cloud-enabled software unlocked the ability to make 10x improvements to pretty much every part of our lives. Your personal life, your home life, your work life, everything had that much friction that was removed.
So then to follow that thought, I mean, now that we're 10, 12 years later into that sort of dynamic has matured.
Yeah.
It's the default now. I mean, it would be pretty rare that someone in this room is going to say, oh, I think I'll go buy 1,000 servers to launch my country. Like, that was just not going to happen. Like, that's the default way you build a company. But we're 10, 12 years into that.
Yeah.
So we could talk about the golden age forever, software eating the world, and all the things we've seen. But what are I think we've started to see then some of the limitations of that emerge.
Yeah.
So if I'm likewise, again, I'm going to default start my company on one of these cloud services, but what are some of the things that you're seeing that are problematic about that may not be evident to, especially like a new entrepreneur sitting in this room, about things they might want to think about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. There's what I would call the CTO answer. What I would tell the engineer about how it's gotten more complex to build a cloud business. And there's what I might call the CEO answer. So I'll start with the CEO version of that answer, which is everything has been commoditized. Whatever you are building as a software company, 20 other people could do it. They probably are, right? And so what that means is it's that much harder to stand out than it was before. Standing out before was this thing that you're doing on paper you can now do in the cloud. Or this thing that you're doing on your home infrastructure or on a desktop application, I can do as an internet application. That actually was enough in many cases to change the way we design, to change the way we drive vehicles, to change so many different things. I mean, look at Tesla as a company. Among the many innovations, one of the biggest one is over-the-air software updates to cars.
Yeah.
It's just cloud. It's cloud computing applied to cars, right? And so one of the hardest things for the next 10 years is, as you go to build your business, you have to think about, how am I gonna create a competitive edge? And what is being customer-centric in 2022 mean? And what is it gonna mean in 2026? What are customers asking for? Because you're not bringing them onto the cloud anymore. If you're building a consumer business, you're not bringing your users into e-commerce or into marketplaces. They're exposed. They Ubered here, well, not here, but they Uber around. They picked up a Bolt and scooted around. They know it. And so standing out becomes a lot harder. And it means you need to know, why is your customer or your user, who is already in the cloud and already has a version of what you're doing, what is their 10x pain point? And that's where it gets really interesting for European startups.
Well, okay, so let's follow that thought, because one of the big conversations in France, where we are, but across Europe, is this question of sovereignty, which seems kind of an interesting but vague notion when you're concretely thinking about, how do I build my startup? What are the choices I have to make? What do you mean by sovereignty? And then there's a question of how best you serve your customers. So how does those things kind of intersect in your mind in terms of how you start to think about choices you make? Because you do have everyone thinks maybe default AWS or Azure or Google, but what are the choices that you have, or questions that you have to start thinking about in terms of what may limit you after you've got started, or things that you may encounter 2-3 years down the road when you've got some traction?
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to give the long answer,
and I'll cut you off.
Yeah, you cut me off when I ramble too long, but I think, again, it's important to understand where we came from. So the last generation of startups, the startups that you guys know about and you go, I want to build the thing that the Skype guys built. I want to build the next TransferWise, right? Those guys were told a really simple half-truth, maybe even a lie, which was, if you want to build $1 billion business, you have to go to the US. It's a very simple notion. It's not very controversial. And if you want to go to the US, you're going to need US cloud companies. You're going to need Amazon, you're going to need Azure, you're going to need Google. You can pick any of them, but you got to pick one. So that is where a lot of people were coming from. And then you come back to the idea that now anyone can build a software company. And what we're seeing today versus 10 years ago is increasingly startups don't care about sovereignty, basically where my customer data is, who has access to it, where do I pay taxes, where is the software that I'm using in the cloud physically residing. However, their customers are starting to ask a lot of questions. And it's businesses you wouldn't really expect to care. You've got consumers, so in France, during the pandemic, a lot of the coordination around vaccination was on a online startup for booking doctor appointments. We call it Doctolib, because that's how French people name it. They name it with the cute accent. They call it Doctolib, right? So everyone was going on Doctolib and putting in their social security number and their symptoms, and they were setting it up, and all of that data was hosted on a US provider. And I'm going to be honest, as someone who understands how they built their infrastructure, it's very secure. They've done a very good job. However, French people were not really comfortable when they found out that their data was technically under the jurisdiction of a government that is historically kind of grade the lines on encryption and decrypting encrypted data, right? And so that becomes a really big problem because Doctolib doesn't care where their data is stored. They wanted to build the best business, so they looked for the best tool at the time. And at the time that they started building the company, there were only 3 people that you really could choose from. However, their customers care. And so now increasingly what we're seeing in Europe is versus the last generation, where building a copycat business, building the X for Europe was kind of a pejorative term. It was like, oh, you're building Twilio for Europe, or Uber for Eastern Europe, or BlaBlaCar for whatever. Now, people are saying, look, given 2 commodity SaaS products that are great, they're not bad just because they're a commodity, but they're not unique. Anyone could build them. I'd rather choose the one where my data is hosted in Europe over the one where my data is hosted in the US. I'd rather choose the local guy and feed into a healthier ecosystem rather than continually enrich Seattle and San Francisco and the US economy.
So then I can imagine the problem would be, like, if I think about this just as a simple-minded journalist consumer, whenever I'm signing up for these things, there's the technology. Okay, it seems seductive because it's global, but it also seems a certain simplicity. I have one relationship to manage with one company that I have to, just keep my eye on one service, period.
Yeah.
So that seems a very attractive, beyond even the technology underneath. Like, great. So that's less of a headache. So why would I? The challenge then for a company like you guys is, you're not at this point positioning yourself as a global provider. So that means, okay, so I've got to get into this multi-cloud sphere where I have it, and that's going to seem instinctively to me harder. Like, even if I don't dig into the technology, my first instinct is, why do I want to use multiple cloud providers?
Yeah, that one's a really interesting one. So very briefly, if you want to build a global business and you're a customer of Scaleway, you go, well, you have infrastructure in Europe, but what do I do when I actually go to the US? Maybe I am only doing business in Europe. What do I do when I go to the US? Or what about when I have a customer based in Japan? And we have a pretty strong answer to that, and you mentioned it, which is we say, well, you just spin up anything on any provider and connect it back into your Scaleway infrastructure, and it's fine. And rightfully so, there has been a lot said about the complexity of managing multiple cloud providers. It's usually coming from the people who have less to gain from you doing that. And the reality is, if you look today, let's forget about infrastructure for a second. Look at your software. You're a Google customer, aren't you? Do you only use Google products?
No.
No. Are you holding a Google phone?
I am.
Okay, you are holding a
phone.
Pixel. Okay, that's fair. Consistent. I'm not, but I read my Gmail on my iPhone. Works fine.
Yeah.
So as consumers, we already live in a multi-cloud world. Like when you open up a browser, you are having a multi-cloud experience.
Yeah.
And what's more interesting is if you go in and talk with your engineering teams, they're already living in a multi-cloud world. These software tools that developers use to build companies today are already all multi-cloud. GitHub doesn't care where your code lives from an infrastructure perspective. The tools that people are using are already multi-cloud. The only reason you hear that it's more complicated is because people don't want you to do it.
Yeah.
But everything already is multi-cloud. And so
Yeah.
we've gotten to this place where you can choose, and this kind of comes back to the conversation about how do you stand out as a company. You can choose to say, I want to do what's best for every one of my customers. And I don't care where, as a founder, I don't care where my data is or what infrastructure I use. That's not where I'm distinguishing myself. However, if I have customers in Europe and they say, look, GDPR, we'd really like to keep the data here. And then I go to Japan and Japan says, look, Japanese version of GDPR, we'd really like to keep our data in Japan. And then I go to US and Americans, we love buying American. We want our data in America too, right? There is no single cloud that can be sovereign everywhere. So if you want to build a customer-centric business today, you're already accepting that if you want to build a global business, you're going to build a multi-cloud business. That's already happening.
So let's talk about then the customer-centric notion of that.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about the data issues, that people are becoming more in tune with this question of where is my data, how is it being handled, how is it being secured. I mean, are there other things that these customers, whether they're small businesses or consumers, that they're coming to these companies and saying, well, I want to make sure you're doing X, Y, Z in terms of your impact, or in terms of your data, other things beyond data that
Yeah, exactly. I mean, customer data is a really tangible one because you hear about it a lot, there's regulation around it, but it's kind of part of this broader change about how startups are choosing to scale right now. And this conference is a really good example of it. It worked out well, but this conference is choosing to do conferences differently. They're not saying, look, we want the cheapest means of distributing drinks, so we're just going to buy plastic cups and give it to everyone, right? They're choosing to do the conference differently. And guess what? It sometimes costs a little more to do the right thing. Not always. If you're an early adopter, it costs a little more, but you make the choice.
Yeah.
And many of us choose to come to this conference, even sponsors, by the way. We accept the fact that we're not going to use anything that's not recyclable and not sustainable at this conference. Our stand is required to be sustainable. It's required to have as little of a carbon footprint. And increasingly, customers are going to software vendors and saying, look, I love your product, but how many trees, I don't want to see another one of those videos of the orangutans fighting with the bulldozers and feel like I'm part of that problem. So customers are now holding companies accountable. We see it with companies becoming B Corps, and they're actually saying, look, we will structure our organization around impact. And the data's out there. Like consumers and businesses prefer to buy from people whose values align with theirs.
Oh.
And so when we talk about scaling changing, it means that whereas the previous generation was in a scale at all costs, I want global domination. I don't care if I have to destroy industries and destroy rainforests to do it. Now people are thinking about scaling differently. And that changes a lot of habits. That changes decisions around the choice that you provide to customers around where their data is hosted and who has access to it. It also changes the type of data center that you're gonna work with. Increasingly, businesses want to know what the carbon footprint is of the data center where their data is hosted. And that's changing what it means to scale a business because it's impacting your ability to beat competition.
And we talked about a little bit about this, but we've started to see in France, but I think other places in Europe, the emergence of the chief responsibility officer. Yeah. That's a kind of thing where, as a journalist, like my flag immediately goes up to be a little bit skeptical that
your BS radar?
Yeah, well, is this they're doing some impact washing, greenwashing, whatever, they're paying lip service to this stuff. I mean, are you seeing those positions also getting involved in these kinds of conversations?
Oh,
Not
yeah.
just like,
Yeah.
we want to donate to some good causes or, talk about our diversity, but also concretely like our technology, our impact.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is technical decisions aren't just in the realm of the CTO or the VP engineering anymore. We talk with a lot of CEOs, and very often decisions around data sovereignty or carbon footprint of data centers, they are technical topics. The implementation is technical, but they're coming from other people. And so, yeah, we increasingly talk with chief impact officers. We talk with when that role doesn't exist, we often see that the CEO is carrying that title implicitly. As a company scales and they have an executive team that can run marketing, can run sales, can run day-to-day operations, what can only the CEO do? He can make sure that he's building something that has a net positive impact on society. Yeah. And so we see the CEOs coming into that conversation. In fact, a lot of conversations about migrating off of one player and migrating onto Scaleway typically start with the CEO saying, I'm kind of tired of seeing my number one line item be a company that I don't really feel like I want to, I wouldn't vote with my wallet for them.
Yeah.
So
are you finding then, as we talk about this evolution, like what scaling is going to look like the next 10 years, it's interesting timing to have this now because we've seen the boom in funding. We know that a lot of these companies are just at this point where they really have to make these concrete decisions about how they're going to massively scale these companies if they're really going to prove these valuations they've been tagged with. So they're going to be under a lot of under the gun to do that. Are you finding that they're organically coming around to this multi-cloud idea, that there's this other option, or are you guys having to really go out and evangelize this notion to say, hey, look, before you go down this one path, there is this other path that you could be considering?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is kind of yes and no. So what we see is the promise of the cloud of like 100% uptime, it'll never go down, is clearly untenable, even for the biggest of players. Slack goes down, Twitter goes down, Google goes down, Microsoft goes down, right? And so I think people are waking up to the idea that, look, like I can't have a single point of failure, and I can't have a single vendor of failure either. And so a lot of people are coming around to that. We had a unfortunate incident in France with another cloud player where they had a data center catch fire. And in the short term, for some people that meant just switching vendors, but for most of the people we talked to, it wasn't about switching vendors. It was about moving from single cloud to multi-cloud and saying, how are we going to be in a position of flexibility and agility in the future?
Yeah.
Because as much as we'd like to think that a software, one company will solve all of our problems, every company has a single point of failure. They themselves are the single point of failure.
Well, the other thing that was surprising to me, just talking to you before, as much as I've kind of followed the evolution of this stuff, there's also that feeling, for all we're talking about, that if I'm still the young entrepreneur thinking about my first decisions, I think, I'll worry about that later. I'm just going to, you sort of reminded me of the phrase, no one was ever fired for buying IBM. Now no one's ever fired for picking AWS.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And so you think, okay, well, so many things going on. I don't really have time to evaluate. And Liam talked about this thing. I'll worry about that in 3 years. I'm just going to jump on Google or Amazon or whoever now. But in fact, once you get down there, it's not so simple as you would think to jump, to wake up if you're Dr. Lieb or someone else and say, you know what, maybe we will do multi-cloud. Let's do that tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's funny because, multi-cloud's a really complicated term. All it really means is interoperability, right? Like reverse compatibility across providers. Like it's a pretty standard concept. Like we expect a set of norms to be established where if I do one thing with one provider, I can go to the other, right? And so I think for a lot of people, the flip side, if you haven't naturally come around to this decision or just realize that your team's already doing it, most people will go, hey, we'd really like to have a multi-cloud strategy. And their development team goes, well, we already do all our testing on these guys, and we have our production there. Is that multi-cloud enough? Well, yeah, it is. Multiple clouds, multiple vendors, not one single point of failure. And as they continue to do that, they go, wow, it'd be really great if these things were interoperable. And that's generally when they try to scale that up, where they go, it's kind of weird that one of these guys is providing a tool that works well with everyone else. And one of these guys is providing a tool where like half of their stuff doesn't work anywhere else, and they're charging me money if I want to try to do it.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird. You know, like one of the weirdest things I find is, you know, in Europe, for example, it's illegal for your mobile plan to make you pay money to switch. You know, there were a lot of regulations that came out and said, like, if you want to change mobile plans, they can't make it hard. Like, it's pretty easy. It's easy in Latvia, I asked. It's easy in France. It's easy in Germany. And that's because they said it's unfair to lock someone into a vendor when the consumer decides they want to leave. And weirdly enough, the cloud is one of the last places that is arguably a commodity bedrock infrastructure where vendors will actually make you pay to leave. There's a very wonderful article about Pinterest, one of those last generation of startups that scaled at all costs, and they would go bankrupt today if they tried to change cloud vendors. Not because as an IT project it's so complex and the product would be hard to replicate. No, just the cost of moving their data off of the vendor they're currently with. There's a fee charged, and that would cost them more money than they have. So they would go bankrupt.
Yeah. Which consequently gives you no leverage to negotiate.
It's really hard to negotiate price when you can't leave.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're stuck in a monopoly, but it's quite hard. Yes.
Just renting apartments.
Yeah, and so, you know, a lot of what we see around people choosing a multi-cloud approach is more about saying, look, I'd rather have a really good set of generalist tools that, quite honestly, any of my back-end engineering team can use, rather than go down a really deep a single approach and only be able to hire specialists and potentially run into areas where if something happens in the market and we need to make a switch in our business, we can't because we're stuck, right? And we take that approach in a lot of different ways. If some of you are marketers, marketing went through a phase where everything was done on one platform. Everyone used Oracle. I know it seems crazy, but everyone used Oracle at some point. And then we said, yeah, but Oracle really isn't good for sending emails, is it? And so we bought a little email tool. And we said, it's not really good for running like paid advertising. So we started using other tools for that. And guess what? All of those tools talk to each other. So you don't actually have to do everything inside of Oracle now. Yeah. That's multi-cloud. That's multi-cloud for marketers or for salespeople. Salespeople don't use Salesforce to send most of their emails. Yeah. It's not a great email client.
But the bottom line here for me is that then it's really worth taking that moment to think, to invest that time at the start when you're really just jumping in to think, okay, what are the implications of what I'm doing?
It's easier to do it. It's easier to do it early. It's a lot easier to change than it used to be. Yeah. When the cloud was still being built, when we were still figuring out different use cases and what architectures people needed, it was really tough. It's gotten easier. It doesn't make it inexpensive. It sucks to be in a situation where you have a $10 million business and you're no longer able to keep up with your business's growth because of technical debt, right? Cloud debt. That's a frustrating experience. So yeah, I mean, like we spent a lot of time at events like this, not really trying to sell Scaleway as much as just trying to tell people, hey, like now's a great time to think about this. Yeah. It's actually, it's easy. Like the switch is really easy. You're probably only using, 4 products on the cloud and all of them are interoperable, which is great. The vast majority of startups use the same 4 things, or they're running on top of platforms using the same 4 things, and those are all interoperable, which is great. But once you start to scale, that's where they start to leak in these products that kind of lock you in, and that's where it gets a little tough. So yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop us on that note.
That sounds great.
Thank you so much for joining us here, and
thanks for the chat,
the insight, and you're around. You're at the Scaleway booth. If you guys want to talk more about Scaleway, multi-cloud.
I'm also on this stage doing karaoke. Oh no, on the other stage, I don't know which stage we're doing karaoke, but I'll be here tonight.
Yeah, don't miss that.
Last night, that's fun too. Okay, thanks guys for sticking around. Had a really great time.
Thank you guys for telling us more. Everything about scaling and everything we need to know about the clouds, I suppose.